So, welcome, Dr. Micah Hauskeller. I'm glad that we're having this conversation and understanding philosophy with different concepts and different perspective. So, you have done a lot of academic work in understanding the concepts of life and death philosophically. So, what is your idea on life? Like, does life have any purpose?
I don't think so. For it to have purpose, we would have to assume that there is some consciousness, some will at the origin of life, because in other words, a deity who has created the world for a particular purpose or designed the world for a particular purpose. And if we don't believe that, to think of nature as having a purpose, this is very difficult to do, because the very notion of purpose is connected to will and consciousness. Now, is there a God who has created the world for a purpose? I have no idea, but I've yet to see any good reasons, hear any good reasons to believe that. So personally, I don't believe that, and I don't think we have sufficient grounds to make such an assumption. So that means I don't think there's a purpose to life. Neither is there a purpose to individual living beings. You might say, is there a purpose to humanity?
Right.
For the same reason, I would say, no, we as human beings don't have a purpose, or you and I as individuals, we don't have purposes because we are not made for a certain purpose. Things have purpose. Things that have been made by people, by us,
Right.
for a certain purpose. A chair has a purpose, a mobile phone has a purpose, a microphone has a purpose, right? We have created them for that purpose. But if the assumption is correct that we have not been created for a purpose, then we don't have a purpose. That doesn't mean, of course, that we can't have purposes as human beings, as beings that have consciousness and a will. We do have purposes. I have purposes, you have purposes, we can pursue those purposes. But I think that is all the purposes there are.
Interesting. So, if we assume that we do not have, the life essentially do not have a purpose, then, a lot of people love to think that they have a purpose because death is kind of something they think is sort of a deadline, and they have to do something just to make their life more valuable. So what's your idea or your perspective on death?
It's true that many people fear death. Very few like the idea of their own mortality, that our time is limited. Personally, I'm not exactly looking forward to being dead. I'm not scared exactly either.
Right.
I think I've made my peace with it, as many people, I suppose, have. Now, how is that connected to purpose, to value, to meaning? You might think that you might be disturbed by the fact that you have to die, in the sense that life may appear pointless to you. Because of that fact. You might tell yourself, well, what's the point of it all? Whatever I do, whatever I achieve, it will end, I will end, everything I have created will end, so what's the point? So there's a certain connection to how between death or our mortality and how we perceive the possibility of living a meaningful life. However, I don't think that this is very sensible, because imagine the alternative, right? In eternal life, so you don't have to die. Then the same question would arise. You have an endless life ahead of you. You would still ask, what's the point of it? Where does it all lead, right? It doesn't lead anywhere. It's just one thing after the other. It continues, but that doesn't make life any more meaningful, valuable, or purposeful.
Right.
Of course, you could have more purposes as an individual, right? You could have an endless, indefinitely long series of purposes to pursue, but that wouldn't make any of these purposes any more relevant, important, or meaningful. So in that sense, I don't think that the fact that we have to die makes much of a difference. There are philosophers who think that. For instance, William Lane Craig, an American philosopher, he said something like, because we end in nothing, we are nothing. So the fact that we have to die, or that if we lived in a godless world, then death is really the end. And Craig thinks we need God for this not to be the end, because if it were the end, nothing would matter, right? If we end in nothing, we are nothing. But of course, or at least it seems to me, that this doesn't quite follow, because we end in nothing, we are nothing, only because only something that exists can end in the first place. Only something can become nothing. And just because things don't last forever doesn't mean they don't matter here and now. Why should something only matter if it matters in the long run? Why should it only matter if it matters forever? Of course, it might be the case that everything we have ever done will one day be undone, or the world will one day be as if we had never existed, we had never done what we actually did. But that doesn't mean that it's irrelevant or pointless to make a difference in the here and now. Right? We can make a difference. We might not be able to change the world, but in a certain way, each one of us changes the world all the time, just by being here and doing certain things. And we do certain things that are good for others, for ourselves. We do certain things that are bad for others or for ourselves. And this is real. It is as real as it gets. Right? We live in a temporal world, and we are temporal beings. And we have to acknowledge that, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. I mean, what I sort of think is that death sort of gives us a reason to pursue a value and lead something more meaningful. I mean, let's say we have this camera. We all know that this camera is not going to work for eternity.
Mm-hmm.
It has a certain deadline. And because it has a certain deadline, we value it and we use it to its maximum so that we can get the best out of it. And I think in that way, death, I mean, if we think death as a deadline, it sort of gives us more reasons to pursue valuable things.
Yeah, you might think that, and has actually been argued that this is the case. So far from actually being an obstacle to living a meaningful life, death would be a precondition of it, because it imposes a limit of what we can do. We have to do it now. We have to do it in this life or period of life. We don't have forever to do it. But then again, I mean, the average human lifespan is quite long in view of in comparison to the purposes that most of us have. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can do, and a lot of things where, because when you're young at least, it seems quite long, and your death that eventually has to come, you know, that is still quite a long way off. You can still say, well, I don't have to do it now. I mean, who feels the pressure when they're young and think, oh, I have to do this now, right? I have to do something valuable. Most people would say, there's still time, there's still time.
Right.
And often there is still time, sometimes there isn't, right? But I don't think many people will actually feel that pressure just because we have to die in a few decades or something, that we have to make use of our time as best we can. I don't think it's a thought that drives many people's plans for what they want to do on an everyday basis, right?
Right.
So, and that's probably also because death or our own mortality is, for us, mostly a quite abstract thought for much of our lives. I mean, of course, if you get sick and you feel it in your bones and your flesh, your own mortality, that might change the situation. But as long as we're healthy and relatively young and fit, we know we have to die, but this is like we're talking about someone else. It's like this syllogism, we might say, all human beings have to die. I am one of them, so I will have to die too. I know that, I accept that. But then when it comes to the actual dying, we might find ourselves surprised that what holds for everyone actually holds also for me. Right? Yeah. So there's a kind of abstract knowledge, but it's not a concrete knowledge. It's easily pushed aside, pushed away. It's not on a horizon. And I mean, it might be different if we were constantly aware in a more concrete, felt way that we are mortal. That might push us to use our time more wisely than we commonly do.
Right. And I mean, in a lot of religions and philosophy of religion, there's also a concept of life after death, or in Eastern philosophy, there are multiple routes after death. You may get reborn, you may get to a certain realm and stay there for some amount of time. So what's your take on these ideas?
Well, it's difficult to say. As I said earlier, for me personally, I don't believe in any of this because as I said, I don't see any reason to believe in God, and that means also I don't see any reason to believe in an afterlife. For all I know, when we die, we are dead, we are gone. I will be gone, right? No consciousness, right. No survival in any form. Now, whether to have some conception of the afterlife is helpful and could make your life better. Perhaps that is the case, right? What we believe obviously influences how we live our lives. And perhaps certain beliefs, whether they are true or false, might actually help us living a better life than it would otherwise be possible. I was just thinking, because you mentioned the idea of reincarnation, of Nietzsche's conception of the eternal recurrence. Right? You can understand this as an actual metaphysical hypothesis, so the idea that we will live our life, the same life, over and over again. But I prefer to see it as a kind of advice how to live our life, this life, namely to live it as if we had to live it over and over and over again. And so live your life as if you had to live it over and over again. And if you do that, right, you are much more conscious about your choices, and you have to choose a path for yourself that you can stand by, that you can say, yes, this is the kind of life that I would want to live over and over again. if I had the chance or if it were necessary to do so.
Right, beautiful. And also there's a lot of change in the way one thinks about life and death. And a major pivotal point comes in when they hit rock bottom in terms of their suffering. I mean, I understand you said that you don't believe that there's a purpose in life, but and also death uh, is not a good source of motivation to value or to create your own
Not a
purpose.
sufficiently strong motivation because
Yeah.
it's such an abstract notion for
Yeah,
much of our
but
life.
then even understanding life, like I come from India, so in Indian and most of the Eastern philosophy, it has been understood that life is essentially a suffering, and that's why death is seen as a sort of a deadline for you, that you need to be strong enough so that you can break the deadline and go into a better realm to live, or an idea of enlightenment. And that seems very interesting for me because I have not seen a lot of involvement of the concept of suffering in understanding life and death. So what's your take on understanding life and death by the lens of all kinds of suffering every one of us goes through?
There is actually philosophical literature which has a very strong focus on human suffering. I mean, philosophical pessimism, represented perhaps today primarily through Schopenhauer's philosophy, Philip Meinlander, then after him, and today, currently, people like David Benatar, who think that life is so bad, actually, that it would have been better for us to never have come into existence in the first place. And Schopenhauer has a very, very strong emphasis on human suffering, right? Basically, life is a hell. And he was inspired by Indian philosophy, actually. We should try to overcome this, find a way out. And interestingly, he thought that dying would not be a way out, because we just renew the cycle of life and we would still be part of it. So his solution to this, again inspired by Indian philosophy, was a kind of negation of the will. So as long as you affirm the will, you affirm life, and you stay within this hell that life is, and the only way out is you negate the will in yourself, and then somehow that might provide a means to escape. And suffering plays a huge role in that, right? So both in the form of one's own suffering. So Schopenhauer thinks that the suffering can become so immense that it leads to a negation of the will. So you just turn your back to life because there's too much suffering, your own. And the second route is via pity or compassion. So all the suffering in the world, and you make it your own because you feel it. And that can also lead to that rejection of the world as a whole, which ultimately then leads to salvation. But generally, however, I mean, I don't know. I was going to say, I don't know whether Schopenhauer is right in his very extremely pessimistic assessment of the world. I don't think that Benatar is right when he says the world is a terrible place, because, I mean, it's a mixed bag, right? There are many good things in life. There are bad things as well. Some people are luckier than others, they have a greater share in the good things. Others are not so lucky, they have a greater share in the bad things. But overall, I think life is certainly worth living for many of us, even if there's probably no life that has no suffering in it. So suffering is part of life.
Right.
Now, is that a bad thing? I mean, hardly anyone would enjoy suffering, but of course suffering can also be an occasion to mature and to build something out of this suffering. Interestingly, Nietzsche, who I mentioned before, once wrote that people don't really mind suffering. What they mind is meaningless suffering. And I think that is very true, because we often seek out suffering or engage in activities that are not entirely pleasurable.
Right.
We do them anyway, even though they involve suffering, because we pursue certain goals, certain projects that we cannot pursue or cannot achieve without that suffering, but we find it worth. And the suffering is okay because it is in the service of this higher goal, which is part of what makes life meaningful for us. But a suffering that is not meaningful, a suffering that has no purpose, a suffering that is utterly pointless, that is something we'd rather avoid, because we cannot integrate it into our lives. It has no place in our lives, and that is a really bad suffering. And of course it often happens at the end of someone's life, right? When there's only suffering left and nothing else, and that suffering cannot lead to anything except to more suffering and then a miserable death. Then this suffering becomes pointless, and then your life somehow seems empty of meaning.
Interesting.
But as a part of life, and as long as it can be integrated and worked with and built up on, and I think it's not a bad thing.
Interesting. Right. So, what's your idea on leading a good life then? I mean, suffering is inevitable. It's a part of life. There's no natural purpose to life, and death is not a concrete source of motivation to lead a purpose and to make life more valuable. So what would be essentially a good life then?
I don't think there's a general answer to that. I mean, there's a philosophical discussion about what makes life meaningful, and many of the philosophers contributing to this debate have objectivist leanings. That means they try to identify certain features of life that have to be present for someone's life to be meaningful. For instance, I might say, you need to change the world for the better.
Yeah.
Right? If you don't change the world for the better, then your life has been meaningless. So there's a certain goal here, a certain purpose, a certain criterion to judge lives by, to judge the meaningfulness of life. So if you make the world a worse place, like, I don't know, Hitler may have done, then this is not just a meaningless life, it is even anti-meaningful, so goes in the opposite direction. Or others might say, well, perhaps you don't have to change the world for the better, who knows what is better anyway, and but you need to connect and engage with things that are objectively valuable. Right? If you like to do philosophy, objectively valuable, naturally. If you want to do art, science, increase knowledge, whatever, play chess. This is good if you like to watch daytime television and, I don't know, drink beer. That is not objectively valuable, and that doesn't make your life meaningful. But the question is, of course, in a way, this is very, how should I say, presumptuous, it's very elitist, very undemocratic in a way, because first it assumes that we know, or I know, what is objectively valuable, right? And it invites you to look down on things that other people do that you wouldn't want to do, and that you perhaps cannot quite understand what they see in it, what interest they have. And the notion of objective value is anyway quite obscure, right? What makes something objectively valuable? We never get to the objectivity of it. All we can ever say is, it is valuable to me, or it is valuable to a lot of people. Possibly, if there's anything like that, it's valuable to everyone. Right? Perhaps there is such a thing. But even if something were valuable to everyone, it would still be only subjectively valuable and not objectively valuable. It just would be valuable to all of us. But objective value seems to assume that there can be something that is valuable even if it's not subjectively valued by anyone.
Right.
So imagine something that no one cares about, no one values. It could still be objectively valuable, right? But if you imagine that scenario, then we end up with a notion, again, that is hopelessly obscure. What could it possibly mean to say that a thing that no one values is nonetheless objectively valuable? So, point is, all we ever have is subjective values, or rather people, living beings that value certain things that they do.
Right.
So are certain things better than others? Well, depends. Do they make me happier than others? Do they contribute to my flourishing as a kind of being that they are? Perhaps there are some activities that are more suitable for that, right? Increase my happiness, increase my well-being, while others don't. Then I might say, well, I'd be, I should better engage with those things, right? Because they're better for me. But that is the only criterion here I can apply. And I think we should be very careful to judge the lives of others and dismiss certain things they do. So if they're genuinely happy doing what they do, if they're genuinely interested and engaged, if that makes for them subjectively their life meaningful, then I don't think we have any grounds to say it can't possibly be meaningful. Right? So ultimately I think everyone has to not decide for themselves, because it's not a matter of deciding what is meaningful and what is not, but rather finding out what makes their life meaningful, what makes your life meaningful. And that might be very different from what makes my life meaningful, although we are of course both human beings, and as human beings we have certain needs that structure also our world of meaning. So what is meaningful for us, right? Certain things are important to both of us because we're human beings. Certain things are important to you, me, and my dog because we're all living beings. But certain things are just important to you and not to me because we're also individuals. And all these aspects need to be acknowledged, and we need to accept that different people have different ways of creating a meaningful life for themselves.
That's beautiful. Great. So, yeah. That's a really interesting answer, because I personally believe that meanings and making life meaningful and understanding the meaning of it is an individual choice, and it is an individual's responsibility to understand and make something meaningful out of themselves. So how was this conversation for you, and if you have any questions for me?
It was good. I liked it. No, we had a genuine conversation. It was good. I don't have any questions, no. I mean, I have lots of questions, but none that we should or can discuss now. So it's good.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.